Hello, everyone. That was a short break, and I blame James entirely for that. But I hope you managed to get done what you needed to do in the break. My name's Giles Whittell. I'm another editor at Tortoise. Delighted to be with you. I'm not at headquarters. I'm in South London, but enough about London. Let's go global today. My head is still spinning with Glasgow, COP, where I spent the whole 2 weeks, spinning with wild optimism and also the cold realism of people like, or skepticism, I should say, of people like Greta, in a city that like to remind us that it brought the world the fossil fuel powered industrial revolution in the form of the steam engine, and hoped that it could set a new example with the UK's biggest fleet of electric buses. The only trouble was that almost all of the charging points were not working. So our exam question for the next 45 minutes, and I know they'll fly by, is net zero: can cities deliver us from the climate crisis? To which one obvious answer is, well, they better be able to, because a lot of us live there. A lot of our human creativity and ingenuity is gathered there. So if they can't, we're a bit stuffed. But another answer, and this is partly autobiographical because I spent the first 6 years of my career in LA, is if you look at cities like LA and Beijing and India, are you kidding? These places generate microclimates that are just completely unlivable. There's a tremendous amount that we can get into on the macro and the micro, from cities as more than the sum of their parts to the electric scooters, whose very, very quick uptake we saw in one of the slides just before we got started. Do, as in all these sessions, dive into the chat. I will try and keep track of it. My colleague Barney will do a better job than me of that, and we'll try and bring people into the conversation. We've got 3 invited speakers, so I'll get straight to it. And I want to start with Andres Guevara, who, as Vice President, Region and City for BP Decarbonisation, is right in the middle of this debate, Andres, because BP, especially for the last year and a half, have been very consciously making this argument that cities as a unit, as a concentration of human endeavor, are part of the solution rather than the problem. Now, my question is really, how is that? But let's be realistic. Let's bear in mind, the embedded carbon in buildings, the carbon in transport, unless the systems are highly sort of integrated, the carbon in airports, and the general thrust in many of the cities to sort of boost growth, boost consumption, that kind of thing. So how are cities, in your view, part of the solution rather than the problem?
Hi, Giles, and thanks for the invite, and great to be here. So I would start with first, well, there's the fact that I think we've heard many times about the fact that something like 70% of emissions are generated in the urban environment in cities. Obviously, it's a proxy for human activity. That's where activity happens. That's where emissions are generated. So if you want to really tackle decarbonization, reduce emissions, you cannot ignore cities. And in that sense, from a BP perspective, when Bernard Looney, our new CEO, came on board in February of last year, he announced a fundamental change in purpose of the company, which meant a massive reorganization, which was about us not only becoming a net zero company by 2050, including our scope 3 emissions, but also helping the world get to net zero. And if you want to deliver on that part of the purpose, you cannot ignore cities, and you need to work with cities and inside cities. So I guess that's number one. I think the second point I would say is that the energy systems of the new energy systems that are decarbonized, I think it's fair to say that are much more integrated than what they have been in the fossil fuel world. So if you think about it, as individuals right now, the energy that is powering the light bulb in my room here is very likely coming from a source of energy that might be wind, might be a bit of gas-fired power, and has nothing to do with the drop of petrol that is in my car or the natural gas that is heating my radiator right now. So, the gas might have come from Trinidad and Tobago, the energy from the North Sea in some kind of wind turbine, and the petrol from some crude oil coming from Nigeria. I'm making it up. The point being that the sources of primary energy are completely different. If you now fast forward into the decarbonized world, the energy systems are becoming much more integrated than what they were. So very likely, a lot of primary energy is going to be around power, and that power is going to be renewable. That's going to light my light bulb, but it's also going to generate hydrogen for the bus I take to go to the office in St. James's Square. So the system is becoming more integrated, and that integration means that suddenly the web of kind of nodes in this system, which is the energy system, are going to be more related. So you can suddenly have, renewable source of power like solar or offshore wind in the UK turning into either electrons or hydrogen that is going to go into heating, it's going to go into transport, it's going to go into lighting. And I think that is why cities are so relevant, because the human activity happens in the city. And it is this integrated energy system that is going to be also more local, taking care of the variety of needs that energy addresses, like light, heat, and mobility. So hopefully that provides a good start.
Yeah, so integration, I buy that, but it is a part of the argument that is possible in cities in a way that it is not more broadly. We hear so much about smart grids spanning the globe, new DC power lines bringing solar power from Morocco to Europe. Is it a core part of your argument that, frankly, more of us have to live in cities to lower the per capita carbon footprint of our species? I couldn't hear you. I wonder who's muted. Simon or Tilly, can you raise a hand if you can hear me? Okay, well, that's good. And you
okay,
can
now, sorry, I was on mute.
Right.
I didn't know how to unmute myself, but
okay,
I think someone helped me behind the scenes.
Right.
So I don't know, Giles, about the question, if that means more people need to live in cities to lower the carbon footprint. The trend is clear. Urbanization keeps increasing over time, despite things like COVID. But I just wanted to address your point of the role of cities. I think cities, because of the materiality they have in terms of emissions, can play a fundamental role in getting the energy transition going, kickstarting it, accelerating it. And I think it's also very important because you want to make sure that the people who live in cities are part of that energy transition and are not left out. I think part of the big theme in my mind of the energy transition is that it's a just transition. So we want to be careful that cities like Aberdeen, for example, that have lived of oil and gas for decades and have developed a human capital base, can actually reinvent themselves as they transition as well, and they can reskill people. And that applies to many cities around the globe. It's not only about kind of oil and gas cities, but I think the cities play a key role in enabling the transition, kind of dropping the first domino to start the domino effect. Mm-hmm. And that's very important in a nascent market like the energy transition market that we're developing. We need to get it going. And I think the cities can provide anchor demand through public transport, so through district heating to get it going. And secondly, keep an eye on a very important element around just transition to make sure this process doesn't leave people behind.
Yeah, take that point. And I hope we'll have a minute to come back at the end on Aberdeen if you want, but also any other examples of cities that offer a microcosm of the broader transition. But first, let me come to Dr. Tilly Collins. This is very exciting for me, Tilly, if I may, because amongst all the other things on your CV, it says that you've appeared on Blue Peter. I've never introduced a guest who's been on Blue Peter before, but you're also an entomologist by training. So you know at least as much about insects as about people, and certainly more than I do. but more broadly, you are an urban ecologist. Can you sketch out your vision of urban sustainability? And I suppose that the question is, how do you get from a city simply being as sustainable as it can be to a city, as we were discussing with Andres just now, actually being a part of a problem, part of the solution, actually sort of reducing the net amount that we pump into the air of greenhouse gases?
I firmly believe that cities are part of the solution, because it's actually really very efficient to keep people in a well-functioning city. The per capita footprint of someone in a well-functioning city is much lower on the whole than rural footprints. Although this may be challenged now, because there's lots of off-grid electrification in Africa that is allowing for relatively sustainable electrification there. But it's not just about the power source. It's about the structural mix. It's about how we build our cities. And on the whole, we have this perception that our global north cities are rather static. But actually, there's a real churn, especially in the commercial sector, of buildings going up and buildings coming down. If you think of central London, the square mile has been built on, a great proportion of the square mile has been built on a couple of times in the past century. So we have an opportunity, and in that slide deck that went whizzing past in the break, there was a clear slide that said wood is better. At the same time, we're planting vast numbers of trees to soak up carbon. And in 30 to 50 years' time, we're going to have this huge stock of timber that we need to do something with. And in that time, we can be coming to design much better buildings out of timber. We can be using the cross-laminate timber structures in a much better way. In this country, we really don't know how to produce cross-laminate timber, and most of our cross-laminate timber structures and our technical timber structures use imports. We've got an opportunity over the next 20 years to really rebuild our cities with a much greater timber focus and reduce the use of steel and reduce the use of carbon, of concrete, in order to bring a much more sustainable structure. And then the third thing is, of course, transport, is how we adopt behaviorally different forms of transport. Another of those slides that said electric bicycle sales have gone bonkers. Well, how brilliant. How brilliant is that? We need to shift people behaviorally onto mass transit systems. We need to consider very carefully the future of the car. Because although the modern electric vehicles do produce fewer exhaust emissions, they're still problematic emissions-wise. And they are still cars on the road, which makes roads hostile to bicycles, etc. So we have all these strands, and we have a huge, huge opportunity. Asia has been leading the way with sponge cities. They've been thinking much more cleverly and carefully about how you manage water in urban environments. And
tell us more about what a sponge city is.
They're what we have here, we call them SUDs, Sustainable Urban Drainage Systems, where instead of, it's trying to stop the concretization of the city surface and deliberately making areas into which water can percolate to avoid overwhelming our plumbed systems, our sewage systems with water. So we allow it to soak into the ground much more. So deliberately keeping open space into which we can actually allow that. And that's being thought of very carefully, especially since they have such, big monsoon patterns.
Right.
Well, here we've got a problem in that way. We're getting much more serious rainstorms, so shorter, harder. And we need to think about that, because otherwise we're going to be overflowing our city centres a lot of the time. So we need to slow down what goes into the systems and allow more of it to percolate into the soil. But we also, as we build these big concrete cities, which I'm generally resistant to, we lose the architectural vernacular of that area. And the architectural vernacular of an area is often so well informed by thousands of years of building in that area. So we have a way of adapting to hot sunshine in many of the North African countries and into the Arab states, narrow streets, not too tall houses so that you can sort of shout at your child from the 5th floor, inward facing water capture that comes into inside gardens, so you get natural shading in the streets. And those buildings are much better for people and much nicer to live in than the modern ambitious equivalent. So not losing the architectural vernacular of areas in favour of a kind of a perception of modernisation is going to be really interesting. And the place.
But you are arguing in favour of changing the architectural vernacular of concrete high-rises. You're arguing in favour of a wholesale swap out.
No, I'm saying we don't need the concrete high-rises.
Right.
We should retain the architectural vernacular and respect what has evolved in a place in terms of being good for housing and good for the people, and learn much more locally. We will be building a lot of cities in Africa, and they don't need to be the size and scale of the mega cities. They probably need to be a lot smaller, which will enable better transport. But it's going to be really, really interesting to try and not swamp them with a kind of global north ideal, but to respect the vernacular that leads to really healthy cities there.
Well, that's a really interesting point, and I'm sure that our other speakers might want to come back on that. But let's talk then for a minute about somewhere like Lagos. I know that that's not one of the ones that's already there, as it were.
Pretty big.
With the best will in the world, that has grown into a megacity of 25 million plus organically, at a very low per capita income, almost zero coherent urban planning, and not to put too fine a point about it, a lot of it is unsanitary and slums. And where do you get the resources and the joined up planning? You can't just conjure it from nowhere to transform that kind of a megacity into the kind that the people who live there need, but also for the purposes of this session, the planet needs.
Yes, well, that's a very big question, isn't it? I think a lot of people are beginning to address that. I think the Prince's Trust came up with a local planning tool that's very applicable to that. Was it 2 years ago? A lot of it is about community involvement. Mm-hmm. A lot of it is about, really understanding what people need and what people want locally, and really beginning to co-design areas so that you can move a slum without necessarily displacing everybody, increase the urban density. We do need to increase those urban densities, but that has to be done with the plumbing and, to a certain extent, the electrification. Although solar in Lagos, I imagine, is probably reasonably a good opportunity, but the storage will be challenging. Storage and buffering of a solar system. Where do you get the planning? You have to have really excellent leadership, which is challenging.
It is. I mean, having said that, they've had some very dynamic local government in Lagos. I can't claim to have been there recently, but it's certainly not a lost cause. It's just a monumental challenge. Look, thank you very much. Let me come now to Simon Burkitt. Simon, you've had many roles, but the relevant one today is that you are founder and director of, and I hope I'm getting the name of the campaign right, Clean Air in London. What really interests me is this: if you deal with air quality, are you simultaneously dealing with climate, or is that just a sort of marginal bonus?
Thank you, Giles, for inviting me and the discussion earlier. 80% of the sources of harmful air pollution and greenhouse gases are the same. It's basically combustion. So there are other things we mustn't forget, the other 20% of each. But if we tackle combustion emissions, we will be dealing with 4/5 of each of those two problems. What's important is that we think of the air as one thing. When we've thought of it in the past as just greenhouse gases, and there are a lot of people who tend to be just focused on greenhouse gases, is we end up with problems like diesel or wood burning, because people pursue those thinking they're being green, but they cause lots of local air quality problems. One of the reasons why my answer to your question about the special role of cities, I think the reason they have such a big opportunity and a big part to play here is because they have a very strong identity and they often have strong leadership. And I think that's very important. And the example I would give you is actually quite topical, which is actually a new Clean Air Act. We had one in 1956 and the cities decarbonised their coal and wood burning emissions then. We need a new Clean Air Act. And actually I presented that at on the main stage of the Tory party conference in October last year at the policy idea session. And it was actually voted second out of 500 by Conservative Party members. And that new Clean Air Act would give metro mayors and local authorities the powers that they desperately need to decarbonise buildings in this modern world in the way that we did so successfully 65 years ago.
Simon, what else would you put in a new Clean Air Act to take the next step? In a sense, the last time we had one, and forgive me, I'm busking it here, but there was the obvious challenge of coal-fired heating, getting rid of those particulates that feature in Mary Poppins, among other things. But apart from more wooden buildings, what else would that kind of legislation bring in an ideal world?
Well, there actually amendments were proposed to the Environment Bill in the Lords, and they had a lot of support. What they need to do is give metro mayors and local authorities the powers to specify zero emission or ultra low emission buildings during refurbishments as well as when they're rebuilt. But it also needs to tackle non-road mobile machinery, the sort of construction yellow plant, generators, those other things which are actually outside buildings. I think we're going to get a lot more refurbishment than rebuilding of buildings because we can't, we have to make such big changes so quickly that we are not going to be able to wait to rebuild the whole of London or other cities. And while your Lagos example is a very good, very powerful example, the total emissions from Nigeria are much, much less than from the developed world or fast developing countries like India and China. And they have quite different sort of governance structures, leadership, political structures. So I think what we need to do is be tackling those countries with those very big emissions in the developed and developing world. And I think what I would say is that, and particularly this is very relevant to cities, we need a mixture, of course, of political leadership, but we need a mixture of technology change. And I like to call it, and the UN tends to call it, lifestyle change rather than behavioral change, which can sound a bit like electrodes on the head. And when I talk about lifestyle change, I'm not talking about some sort of communist approach or something. What I'm actually talking about is a whole category of things, a spectrum of measures, which are typically left out of the cost effectiveness or cost benefit studies that are done by the European Commission, British government, everyone else. And the reason that governments tend to leave out lifestyle changes from their assessments, and I sat in a meeting with UN colleagues for 4 years when I was advising UNEP. And one of them said, I said, well, lifestyle changes have benefits and no costs. And this person from the US State Department sort of stroked his beard and he said, they have political costs. And it was a very profound moment for me. And what I realized is that as campaigners, what we do is make the political costs of inaction greater than the political costs of action. And that's, for example, what we've done very successfully with diesel. And the lifestyle changes I'm talking about are a spectrum which go from bans at one end through to charges, like the ultra low emission zone or something, campaigns to build public understanding, incentives, and then adoptions like seatbelt. And we need to be including this package of lifestyle changes alongside technology solutions to get us towards, I would say, not so much net zero, because I am very skeptical about the net in net zero, a bit like I am about offsetting generally, is that the unifying theory to tackle air pollution and climate change is actually zero air emissions. If we have that clarity, we want to eliminate emissions to the air. That is actually the task ahead of us. If we do that, we will avoid a whole lot of dangers of going down these paths where we think we don't really have to tackle the problem.
Okay, and I mean, that sounds great. Does it resonate? Is it remotely plausible, zero air emissions in a modern mega city?
It is, because one of the other hats I wear, as well as Clean Air in London, is I chair the Knightsbridge Neighbourhood Forum. And for the 4 years when I was sitting on this UNEP steering group, I was actually working on the Knightsbridge Neighbourhood Plan, which includes some lovely colleagues at Imperial College, including the Sustainability Centre there. And we produced 40 planning policies. It was the first adopted or made neighbourhood plan in the whole of central London. And when I was going around talking to developers and landowners, I actually said to them, why are you putting in a gas boiler? This was a planning application for a huge half a block development between Harrods and the top of Sloane Street. And they said it was because there were these perverse incentives in the planning system previously. They would get bonus BREEAM, the sort of energy efficiency sustainability points, if they put in decentralized power generation. And I said to them, well, why are you doing that? And they said, well, because it helps us get the excellence score that we need to get planning approval. And I said, well, what do you actually want to do? And they said they didn't want to put in these gas boilers and systems because they have pipes, they leak, they need to be maintained. They actually want to do all electric buildings. So all of the developments that we've been looking at recently in this part of central London, and also with house builders I've talked to as well, much more widely, is that they really want to have highly energy efficient buildings, which means refurbish existing buildings, but they also want to make them all electric buildings, so they don't have to worry about these fossil fuel sources. Okay. That's their choice. This is a commercial decision. That's what they want to do commercially.
Understood. I just want to make a point to you. Well, actually, Phoebe's made it in the chat that air pollution is a way in which individuals can find it easier to deal with behavior change because it affects people personally. But extrapolating that onto a mass scale, I just want to ask you, coming back to Beijing and India and other large cities with chronic air quality problems, is that proving a better rallying cry for climate action and indeed a better driver for policy change than just focusing on the climate arguments on the nose? I mean, it seems to be the case that for someone in Xi Jinping's position, or indeed his climate advisor, it's easier to make the argument for the kind of policies that we need for the energy transition by saying, look, and by the way, your kids will stop choking on their way to school.
Well, of course it is. And in fact, I've been campaigning for 15, 16 years for Clean Air in London every day. And my vision when I started all that time ago was a sort of 2x2 table or 3x3 table, sort of, which is air pollution, or the air being split between air pollution and climate change or greenhouse gases, London as a mega city, or you could choose Beijing or any other, but London and rest of world. And to me, 15 years ago, it was blindingly obvious that sort of people talking about these big reductions in greenhouse gases by 2030 and 2050 seemed that they were sort of like a general behind the front lines in the First World War, drawing a sweeping line to invade through France or Germany, depending on which side of the lines they were on. Whereas in that top left box, air pollution laws, World Health Organization air quality guidelines, which by the way have just been slashed on the 22nd of September by half or 3/4 for different pollutants. In that top left box, London air pollution, health and legal limits are being breached every day by a factor of 2 or 3. Now, my vision was that if you could actually tackle through political leadership, technology and lifestyle change, that top left box, the trenches as it were, you can actually show the whole world how to deal with these wider climate and sustainability challenges. So what you've described is exactly what I've been trying to do for 15 years.
Well,
and it works.
Yeah, it does seem to be paying off. Let's hope quickly enough to make a difference. I promised that we would come back to the sort of public-private partnership model that may be possible in cities in a way that it's not elsewhere in a second, Andres. But first, I want to do 2 things. Come back to Tilly on the subject of trees and timber and new kind of building. And Isabella Tree's given herself away in the chat. I know that you're just asking for a link, Isabella, but I also know about the book, brilliant book that you've written about wilding. And if you wouldn't mind addressing this question after Tilly has, the question is this: how can we make the growing of all those trees with which we're going to rebuild our cities sustainable in and of itself, bearing in mind the warnings that we've all heard about arboreal monocultures as distinct from the kind of wilding that we understand is much better for the purposes of carbon sequestration. So is that too long a question, or do you see where I'm heading there? Tilly, you first, and then we'll come to Isabella if that's possible. Oh, you're still
unmute
muted.
myself. It takes a while to unmute myself. Actually, I need to say thank you to Isabella, because she and Charlie used to host my students in the summers, and I've had wonderful students work on their estate using the chronosequence of abandonment so that they can monitor ecological change through time. So thank you. We need both, is the answer. We certainly need, it doesn't have to be a monoculture, but we need cropping timber so that we can maintain those areas of land in an increasing lockdown phase. Because a forest, as it grows, the amount it locks down will tail off as the trees mature. And in order to keep that area of land really soaking up carbon, we're going to have to move that crop off and do something intelligent with it. The most intelligent thing at the moment seems to be technical timbers, moving this wood into both high value wood and into technical timbers. But also there's a huge potential for biochar with the residue, where you can you essentially kiln burn it, which is very low emission, but then it produces what is the most marvelous fertilizer. So dug back into the ground and used as filtration systems, it's a really positive way of using that. So we need a mix, we need the biodiversity, we need to not be cutting down forests that we've got already, which are doing a good job. We need to be expanding our forest area, but with a mix of crop and, mosaicked through that conservation grade woodlands where animals, insects, plants can live, and we can maintain the biodiversity and the ecosystem services that the biodiversity delivers to us.
Thank you. Isabella, thanks for allowing us to shine the light on you in your office. How does that sound to you, cropping timber?
I mean, of course, I think, we're going to need timber increasingly, and, so many of your panelists have already said, to construct more of our buildings through timber. And I know that some of the regulations are now getting more and more difficult, particularly post-Grenfell, about how we make wood safe in our buildings in cities. So technology is obviously going to play a big part in how we construct and use timber for safe buildings. And also, of course, we need to be using our own timber rather than importing timber for the products that we use in our daily lives. Of course, we're going to need forestry, but we also need to just get trees out in the landscape, and including in our cities, which is obviously a little bit more difficult, but we're really banging the drum for natural regeneration, because when you're planting trees and purely thinking about it in forestry terms, you are skipping a whole sort of succession of vegetation that it goes between the soil and trees. So you're missing out all the thorny scrub, those incredible woody scrub species that are so important for all life. You know, one of the most biodiverse habitats we know is scrubland, which is completely denigrated in the modern mindset. And one of the things I think that we forget when we think about trees is that when we're always propagating them and importing them from nurseries, which currently are mostly abroad, that's hugely carbon intensive, but it's also reducing the genetic stock of those trees. So if we're going to want to have trees in our landscapes that are truly resilient to climate change and disease, we need to preserve that massive genetic diversity of wild trees. And the only way we can get that really is to let nature do its own thing.
Thank you so much. And I realize I didn't introduce you properly. For people who don't know, Isabella is supervising the wilding of a large estate in Sussex, which you can visit and see these amazing old cows and storks, which are all living along with the high carbon scrubland that is taking over where there used to be just ordinary Sussex fields. Slight handbrake turn before we run out of time. So I want to go back to Andres and more specifically cities and urban planning. What is it that you're trying to do with Aberdeen as an example of a city as an organizing principle to make the transition that the rest of us have to do on a planetary scale?
Yeah. So I think obviously Aberdeen, it's a city we know well because of the North Sea. We've been there for more than 50 years. But I think most importantly, there is first of all, a very strong alignment around our ambition to decarbonize and reinvent ourselves, both BP and the city of Aberdeen. And I think, I don't know if it was Simon or Tilly, but the leadership that I think Aberdeen has shown is fundamental. And I think is having that courage to say, you know, I'm going to actually lead this and from the front. And the reason I think Aberdeen is an interesting example is because the most cities control, for example, their public transport system. They might not operate it themselves, but they control the public transport system. Some of them operate them, and that might be, you know, buses, water boats, trams, trains, whatever it is.
E-bikes.
E-bus, but bus in general. I didn't want to qualify it because the relevance of that is that the city can have anchor demand that actually can be the first domino in the process to be decarbonized. And why is that relevant? Because the energy transition problem that we're facing is this chicken and egg cycle of you don't have supply of new energies because you don't have demand, or you don't have demand because you don't have supply. So I think a key theme here is collaboration between supply and demand. And in this case, the city can play a role on both fronts. But most importantly on the demand side by saying, you know, I want to be a net zero city, assuming that's the line. In the case of Aberdeen, it's 2045 net zero, which brings all the air quality points that Simon alluded to as well, of course. And I control my public transport system. I have a vision of reinventing myself from the oil and gas capital of Europe to becoming the green capital of Europe, leveraging on my wind resource and also on the human capital that the oil and gas industry has developed over the decades, because a lot of those capabilities are transferable to the new energy world. So what I think is really fascinating about the Aberdeen experience is we said, well, we know how to develop and operate energy systems that are decarbonized. You want to take the lead decarbonizing, why don't we work together? So what they have announced recently is that after a very intense procurement process that we obviously participated in, they have selected BP as their partner to create a joint venture that is going to develop an integrated energy system that goes from renewable source of power, production of green hydrogen through electrolysis of water, fed by this clean green energy, and refueling stations that are going to be supplying the fleet of buses of the city. They have made a choice to go down the path of fuel cell electric vehicle buses. And that's just the first step. But it also happens that Aberdeen has the largest, I believe, district heating system in the UK, to my surprise. So they burn natural gas in 4 combined heat and power units, CHPs, that heat water, and that water goes into pipes that go into properties, around 22,000 council homes and buildings, and that's how they are heated. So of course, we need, they will need to work on retrofitting to increase energy efficiency, but there's also some fundamental need around heat for those homes be more or less efficient. They need the heat. So what if, going back to my point of the integrated energy system, you start by decarbonizing public transport. They provide the anchor demand to break the chicken and egg cycle. You start developing capabilities in the new energy space by transferring some of the skills that the city already has in its people into the new energy world. And by doing that, you make it much easier now to test what if we decarbonize the district heating system by blending hydrogen or substituting natural gas for hydrogen. We need to evaluate it, of course, but all I'm saying is it opens all these options as this energy system develops, and it's all because the city said, I am going to actually provide the anchor demand to enable the creation of this new value chain. And that comes with jobs, it comes with air quality improvements, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Let me take it a step further just to finalize the point.
Yeah.
The harbor of Aberdeen happens to be in the city center. When these vessels berth in at the harbor, they need to keep the lights on for all the reasons that we know they need to keep the lights on. Sometimes they keep the engines on, burning diesel, which is not only emitting, but also actually damaging the air quality. And you see this in cities like Hamburg, cities like Valencia, cities like Rotterdam. So the interesting thing is that the renewable sources of energy that you have for the hydrogen production can be then optimized by actually decarbonizing the harbor as well. So again, it shows how the integrated energy system can expand and create the economies of scale and the optimization to make it commercially sustainable, which is ultimately what we all want.
Thank you. I want to give all 3 of you a chance to point to a city which, in your view, is the future before we run out of time. And perhaps I'll have to say to Simon, it can't be London, and to Andres, it can't be Aberdeen. But I very quickly, Andres, I wanted to drill down on fuel cell buses. We had a couple of routes with them in London. They were great, produce only water, but very expensive. Have you funded this with Aberdeen properly? There must be some need for somebody to pony up a big old subsidy.
So the city already got funding to replace some of their buses. So I think they have something like 15 already up and running. I've seen them actually around the city. They're acquiring another 10 that are arriving. They have a fleet of around 140. So this is a whole plan of substitution. Now, I think most importantly on the side of the commercial sustainability, this is a joint venture. Both BP and Aberdeen City Council are co-investing in developing the assets I just described before, kind of solar, electrolysis, and refueling. And I want to stress that there's existing regulation from Department for Transport around something called renewable transport fuel certificates, which basically, when you substitute diesel for green fuels, you can get a certificate that can be traded in the market. And that plus the hydrogen price that the buses pay as a fuel makes the equation work.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm getting an Oscar-style warning about time running out. So, Simon, very quickly, where is the future and why? In terms of cities,
New York or Paris. I mean, I think the C40 Cities initiative that's led by Michael Bloomberg and Mark Watson people. I mean, they are doing incredible work, and I would actually sort of cheat and ask them to pick one of their cities because they've actually got 1,000 who are doing great work. But if you had to ask me, I would say, New York or Paris really are doing some great things, and London is being held back, for example, by this continued dragging out of the TfL refinancing. And there's talk today of the mayor perhaps having to shut down one tube line or something. You know, this would be a massive backward step, and in its petty politics. I'm not blaming, you know, both sides are to blame, I'm sure, but it's petty politics getting in the way of these really big transitions that we have to make.
Okay, thank you, Tilly. I'm sorry to have left you a little time, but where is the future for you in urban terms?
I would support either Paris or New York. I think New York faces real problems though, because they're going to have a terrible time with sea level rise. Paris is going to have a much easier time. It's much further up a river. There will be things they can do to stop it. I also think Barcelona is doing very well, and they're aggregating a lot of really intelligent academic thinking about the future of cities, and they're trying it out on themselves to see if it works. So as Paris and New York have gone, I'll go for Barcelona.
That's uplifting. Nobody said Copenhagen. Nobody, any of the usual suspects. We didn't have Amsterdam all over again. So something's moving. Look, thank you all very much. 45 minutes is no time at all for a massive subject, but I've done a heck of a lot of underlining of my notes. Right off the top, Andres was bigging up cities as sort of laboratories in a sense for integrating new energy systems. Point taken. And Tilly made the simple but important point that they can and should be the most efficient way of bringing people together. We never got on to insects as an example of that, termite hills, but perhaps at another time. I learned today about cross-laminated timber, about sponge cities, the possibility of using biochar from felled timber as fertilizer, and as we just said, well, as you just said, some of the cities, perhaps counterintuitively, that are doing the most progressive work in showing how cities as an organizing unit can be part of the solution to the climate crisis are the big old megacities, New York and Paris. Thank you all very much. I am not going to run over too much in order to give you time to put the kettle on. The next session is being run from Canada by the Globe and Mail's architecture critic, Alex Buzikovic, and forgive me if I've mispronounced your surname, on what is the purpose specifically of city centres now. So that'll be fascinating. Do join Alex and his guests, and thank you to all mine, Simon, Tilly, and Andres, and Isabella for joining. See you again very shortly. Bye now.